We are recording.
Okay, we'll get started. I'd like to welcome you all to the October meeting of the Long Island Regional Planning Council. As is our custom, we start off with the Pledge of Allegiance, and I ask that you remember in your thoughts and prayers the 13 members of our armed forces who were killed in Afghanistan a couple of months ago, as well as all the men and women who continue to serve our country, put themselves in harm's way each and every day so that we can enjoy the freedoms that we do. I ask Michael White, our Vice Chair, to lead us in the pledge. Michael?
I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty, and justice for all. Okay. Rich, like do a roll call?
Yes. Thank you, John. John Cameron,
Present.
Michael White,
present.
Teresa Sanders,
Present.
Jeff Kraut,
Present.
Elizabeth Custodio,
Present.
Mayor Barbara Dono,
Present.
Jeff Guillot.
Present.
John, we're just waiting for either Mayor Kennedy or Supervisor Clavin to join us, and then we'll have our quorum necessary to.
Rich, I'm sorry,
conduct
maybe I missed it. Did you call Teresa Sanders and Liz Custodio?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, good. I want to make sure. Okay, so we're still missing two for our quorum. Maybe when they, maybe Alan, you could explain the technology to everybody here first and to our audience.
Absolutely, and thank you for the opportunity. This is Alan Belniak with VHB, helping administer the meeting. If you've been with us before, thank you. Welcome back again. Appreciate that. If this is your first time, what we're going to do is work through some business, and then we have a presentation. We do want feedback from you all, and there's two ways you can do that. If you're using the Zoom controls, it does not look like we have any dial-in participants, so this should be relatively easy. Down below, there's a Q&A panel. You click that, and you can type in your question or your comment, and when the time is right after the presentation, we will read out the question or comment and share it with the audience and the panelists here. If you would prefer to share your question or comment verbally, you can use the raised hand button, and that simply sends a command to me to let me know that you'd like to speak. And when the time is right, I'll call out your name. I'll send a command to your device to unmute your line, in which case you have the floor again to ask your question, share your comment, and again, the panel will reply. One other item worth noting is that we are recording this meeting for archival purposes, so just want to let you all know that. And I'll announce that once more when we get to the Q&A portion of the meeting. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to John and Rich to continue the meeting.
Okay, great. Rich, I guess we'll start with our presentation then. We're very fortunate today to have with us an old friend meaning in longevity, not in age, but Tom DiNapoli, Long Islander, good friend of Long Island as well as the environment. And Tom has agreed to present to us today a synopsis, basically what his office is finding in the state and what they're learning through the pandemic, as well as how things affect the economy of here, Long Island, et cetera. Tom, it should be mentioned here that Tom, as I mentioned, has always been a friend of the environment and Long Island. And one particular instance we've seen in the last couple of months, we're very active, as you know, on the Regional Planning Council with regard to the Long Island Nitrogen Action Plan. And one of the major projects on Long Island is the sewering of the southwest areas in southern areas of Suffolk County. And the Forge River project, which is the largest project in Suffolk County, was at risk of being actually canceled. The county reached out to the state controller, and thanks to Tom DiNapoli, the timing was put on hold, and Tom was able to retrieve and save that project. So as a result, the county's moving forward with the Forge River sewering project. So Tom, thank you very much. Long Islanders, in particular Suffolk County, but also all Long Islanders, thank you for your intercedence there and for actually helping to save that project. There's many things, as we all know here, Tom's been involved in for many years. But Rich, maybe I'll just turn over to you, give a final introduction to Tom, and then we can let Tom do a presentation. Okay.
Yes, we've been very fortunate to have Tom as our controller since 2007. He's been elected in 2010, 14, and 18 as the controller. He is the sole trustee of and it's $270 billion New York State Common Retirement Fund, one of the largest institutional investors in the world. The controller's office maintains the accounting system and administers the state's $16.7 billion payroll. He's provided robust oversight of school district operations and education spending and developed an early warning system to identify municipalities and school districts showing signs of fiscal distress. And as John mentioned earlier, he's been a great friend of Long Island. You know, we have the Long Island Nitrogen Action Plan to get sewers in place is a critical component, and he came through with some very important approvals in a timely fashion. Many of you are aware of the fact that the Forge River was approved last week. They'll be breaking ground soon, and that's a critical part of our nitrogen action plan. So thank you again, Tom.
Thank you, Rich, and thank you, John. Thanks to both of you and to all the council members. It really is a privilege for me to have the opportunity to speak with you virtually. I look forward to when we can do it in person once again, because looking at the participants on the council, so many of you are friends of long standing. We've worked together on so many issues over the years, and I really do appreciate the work of the Long Island Regional Planning Council. I love being a Long Islander, but I recognize that one of the challenges for our region is the fact that we are made up of a number of towns and villages and a couple of cities, and certainly 2 big counties. The ability to have a unified regional perspective on so many important issues sometimes is a real challenge. And the Long Island Regional Planning Council really was set up to be the entity to give that regional focus and force. So thanks to all of you for the great work that you're doing. Certainly to John as a chairman and your colleagues on the council. You're all busy people with a lot of other responsibilities. The fact that you take the time to devote your leadership skills to the council really is commendable. And to Rich Guardino, who I've worked with in different capacities over the years, but always appreciated, Rich, your professionalism and your smarts, and with all your vast experience, it's wonderful to have you as executive director of the Long Island Regional Planning Council. I thank you both, by the way, for mentioning our approval on that project. You know, every now and then there actually are some responsibilities that are unique to the controller's office where I do have the chance to weigh in, and suffice it to say, you know, partially because of COVID, but just generally because of what happens with approvals and bureaucracies, it did take some effort to explain to the folks whose desk that paperwork, if I can use that old-fashioned term, was sitting on, to have them understand the importance of timeliness of that approval. So I was really pleased that not only the counties, but I heard from the towns, I heard from business, I heard from labor. Long Island Federation of Labor reached out. So really, it was a concerted effort to get our folks to move. And that outreach made it easier for me to say, hey, folks, this really is important. Let's get going on it. So I'm glad, I really am glad that that worked out. So there's a lot been going on the past 19 months. What I thought I would do in our discussion, and I know we have time for Q&A, is just give you our perspective from the controller's office, both in terms of the economy, the state budget, some of the trends that we're seeing on Long Island. Look, we all know it's been a very difficult 19 months. New York was hit early and hard. Certainly from a public health perspective, we all know so many people that have been touched very directly by COVID-19. Hope all of you on the call are safe and well, and your families are safe and well, but we certainly know, especially early on, too many families that not only had people get sick, but people died as well. Thankfully, in our region, our healthcare systems responded effectively, but certainly in the beginning, everybody was overwhelmed by what was happening. And to an extent, we're still having to deal with the other reality of carrying our masks around. And the Delta variant has certainly slowed down what we thought was a pretty strong recovery underway. We still have a number of people that have chosen not to be vaccinated, although those numbers seem to be improving. And from a Long Island perspective, as you know, and looking at all the numbers, Long Island as a region has a higher percentage of vaccinated individuals compared to most regions of the state. And again, compared to other regions of the state, one of the lowest infection rates. Still, many issues out there, and dealing with mandates now, and what that's meaning for many of our workers, particularly in the healthcare area, home healthcare aides and so on, short-staffed already. Some folks not able to continue in their employment if they choose not to be vaccinated. And from a business perspective, my office just this week started bringing people back. I'm actually speaking to you from our New York City office, which up until this week, we really had been closed basically since March of when this whole thing started. So, and we're not back 100%, but we're certainly back with more people in the office environment than we've had in the past 19 months. And even being in Manhattan today, you're certainly seeing more activity on the street, but to the extent that New York City is still such a key part of our state's and our regional economy, the fact that the city continues to lag behind other regions in terms of regrowing jobs, having people come back to the workplace, that certainly is one of the drags on our economy and what that means for revenue coming to the state as well. So, hope you're all safe and well. And I don't preach on public health because I'm not qualified to, but I got my 2 shots and planning to get the booster very soon. And let's hope that people are paying attention to the science and have us continue to get back to whatever the new normal is going to be. And hopefully it'll increasingly look like what the old normal was like, although, as I'm sure you're seeing in your respective workplaces, be it, business or nonprofit or government, there will be some lasting changes in terms of, how we all operate. So, I mean, the underpinning to everything that we focus on in terms of the economy and impact on government of tax revenue, all of it certainly is still tied to what's happening with the pandemic. That is still the big driver of what's happening and our response to that. From our perspective, despite some of the fits and starts that are happening now with the Delta variant, certainly the economy has been in a state of recovery. And that's good news, and that certainly underpins the revenue picture that we're seeing at the state level and the local level. There are other factors as well that I'll touch upon, but just looking at some of the macro numbers as far as the economy, the unemployment numbers have continued to improve. Over the summer, the New York State unemployment was at about 7.4%. New York City still double digit, a little over 10%. So again, that whereas New York City often is the strong driver of our economy, in fact, in many ways, New York City's recovery has been lagging other parts of the state, again, because of how hard the city was hit and how lasting some of the restrictions have been on the economy. When you look at the numbers just outside of New York City, you're talking about an unemployment rate a little over 5%. For Long Island, over the summer, 5% unemployment, so actually a little better than the rest of the state. And certainly when you compare it to close to 18% unemployment back in April of 2020, a big improvement in terms of the Long Island numbers. In terms of job recovery over the summer, we have hit about 56% of gaining jobs back that were lost. So, a little over half. So we still have out of that 1.9 million jobs that were lost at the low point of the impact of the pandemic, we still have a long way to go to bring all of those jobs back. Most of the job gains over the summer not surprisingly because of the population density, were in New York City, Long Island, and Orange, Rockland, and Westchester. In terms of recovery, different sectors are responding in different ways. Manufacturing, retail, construction, very strong, close to 70% in each of those categories, healthcare as well. Education services, only about a third of the jobs have grown back, and government basically has been flat, only a growth of about 4%. Interestingly enough, and this certainly is partially a Long Island impact, leisure and hospitality, which in other parts of the country continues to be in a negative as far as the job picture, we actually saw over the summer regrowth statewide, over 7,000 jobs in leisure and hospitality. So that's good news to the extent that in terms of tourism and related industries, we're very dependent on that, certainly in the city to an extent on Long Island. That's positive news. For the Long Island region, again, looking over the summer, faring a bit better than the statewide numbers. Almost 63% of the jobs that were lost during the pandemic have come back. Again, leisure and hospitality has fared very well on the island. Actually, over 90% of those jobs have come back. Arts, recreation, entertainment, virtually all those jobs have come back. Professional services also very, very strong. Similar to the trends and numbers I mentioned earlier, government, education, those are areas that have been lagging in terms of job regrowth. You know, it's interesting because we're also seeing some, variation in terms of the economy. We hear particularly, and I'm sure all of you do, from some of our smaller businesses and retail, often having a hard time hiring people, right? We have a need for employment and jobs, yet many businesses are finding it hard to fill some of those jobs. Obviously, different theories as to what the case is. And I know Newsday just did an article the other day that talked about our retailers heading into the holiday season, and many of them are very concerned about having adequate staff as we head into the holidays. So certainly a very uneven picture in terms of how this is impacting on the employment picture and the businesses on the ground. Sales tax collections, we look at that very carefully as a government revenue. It's the second largest revenue source for the state, and for our local governments, especially our counties, it's actually a bigger revenue source than property taxes. And as you know, not just on the island, but across the state, the counties share in varying degrees a portion of sales tax revenue with the municipalities within their jurisdiction, and actually in some limited instances with school districts as well. Certainly, in terms of, remember when the pandemic first hit, sales tax revenue dropped, over 27%. I mean, the economy went on hold, everything stopped. For all of 2020, we were down 10% for the year. As the state has reopened and the economy has started to come back, sales tax collections have certainly rebounded significantly. Looking at the numbers, and they're big numbers. I mean, you look at the second quarter for this year, 2021, compared to last year, we were up like 49%. And it's easy to say, well, last year was so bad, what does that number mean? And in the third quarter, as things start to level off, we're still up 20% year over year. What we have found interesting in terms of comparison is not so much to how we are doing in 2021 versus 2020, but looking at the pre-pandemic numbers in 2019. And both for the second quarter and third quarter numbers, we're ahead of the 2019 figure. So for the third quarter of the calendar year, we're up 8.6% statewide in sales tax collections over 2019. So I think that really speaks to the fact that we are seeing a significant increase in economic activity as measured by sales tax collections. Certainly for Long Island, similar big numbers in terms of the jump from this year to last year. For the region, up some 60% in the second quarter, but also similar when you do comparisons to 2019. Looking at the latest for the third quarter for the region, actually up 17%, even higher than those statewide numbers. About 14% in Nassau, 19% in Suffolk. So again, as one measure, of economic activity, sales tax is a positive sign, a positive trend. In July of 2021, we reported on taxable sales that are being generated by internet-based vendors. As you know, state and local taxes on these sales are now being captured because of some changes in state policy pursuant to court decisions. And our analysis for the 12 months ending in February of this year statewide, that the internet sales accounted for 4.6% of taxable sales statewide, generating about $686 million in sales tax revenue. When you look at the Long Island numbers, 4.9% of all taxable sales on Long Island were from these internet vendors, generating an estimated $135 million in sales tax revenue, 62 million in Nassau, 4.7 million in Suffolk County. So I think that's another piece of some of the positive news on sales tax is that certainly during the pandemic, increased reliance on internet for purchases and shopping, and now being able to collect taxes there, that's part of the reason why we're seeing some of those strong numbers. As you all certainly have been observing from the Newsday articles and those who are involved with real estate, median home values continue to go up significantly, both in Nassau and Suffolk County. Year end in 2020, values were up 12.8% in Nassau, 17% in Suffolk. Home sales as well, very significant activity, somewhat limited by inventory because of the strength of the sales. But again, to the extent that the real estate market is another indicator of economic activity, Long Island has been doing very well, certainly in comparison to many other parts of the state. So I won't spend a lot of time on other indicators, but let me kind of transition into talking about the state budget, and certainly I mentioned some of those economic indicators because when the economy is doing well, it should follow that not just sales tax, but other tax revenue, personal income tax, and so on, that the state relies on, taxes from real estate activity, that the state's budget and financial picture will be stronger. And that's certainly the case. We put out a monthly report on revenues and spending. We call it our cash report. And looking at the most recent numbers, we found that the state budget was coming in terms of revenue, when you balance out the expenditures, $5.9 billion ahead of what was projected when the budget was put together back in April. So, when you think back to, last year, we were, facing, severe possibility for severe budget cuts because of what was happening with the pandemic and the loss of revenue, significant revenue drops. I mean, to now be, 5.9 billion ahead of projections is certainly a very different circumstance than we had anticipated. It's obviously for a combination of reasons, not just the fact that the economy has been recovering, and that is obviously a key part of it. But we have to recognize that what's really kept us afloat in the state, not only for the state government, but for local governments as well, has been the infusion of a very significant infusion of federal dollars. As you recall, last year, we did get money from Washington, largely for reimbursement of COVID-19 related expenses at the government level, healthcare system, for our schools as well. But the real game changer with where we're at now in 2021 is the money that's come from the American Rescue Plan with the change in administration, change in Congress. Have to give credit from my perspective to the Biden administration, and it hasn't hurt to have Chuck Schumer, our own Chuck Schumer from New York, as Senate Majority Leader. That $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan resulted in $12.7 billion coming directly to the state. 4.5 billion of that, 12.7, was used to balance this year's budget, and the remaining dollars will be utilized, phased in over a period of time. A significant amount of money because the legislature looked at the federal money coming and looked at the needs that are out there, and really decided to up the investments in two key areas: education and healthcare. A $1.4 billion increase in foundation aid. It's for our schools. That's been a big debate and big issue in lawsuits over a period of years, and a commitment to grow out that foundation aid for the foreseeable future. For Long Island, the school aid was up some 13% for both Nassau and Suffolk County. Foundation aid alone and Nassau up 17%, Suffolk County up 11%. So certainly that bet on education, which I think is a good bet, benefited from the fact that the state was in a stronger fiscal position because of the federal aid, because of the revenues coming in better than expected. Money put aside for economic development as well. Some of it passed through of those federal funds, $600 million for small businesses to help give them more credit support as they recover from the pandemic economy, $800 million in the Small Business Recovery Grant Program, more money for environmental infrastructure, another $500 million for the Clean Water Infrastructure Act, part of a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar investment from the state. I should also mention that part of what explains the increased revenue picture for the state is not just the federal money and not just the economy being stronger, but the legislature and the governor also made a decision to increase tax revenue by increasing taxes on higher income New Yorkers and also increase certain corporate taxes on larger corporations. The personal income tax increase affects less than 1% of New York's taxpayers. But as always, keep in mind that although it's a small percentage by number, that 1% that are impacted by the higher tax rates carry about 32% of the overall personal income tax revenue that the state generates. Personal income tax revenue tends to be volatile. So, the early concerns that because of the higher tax rates, particularly for people who live in New York City, when you combine the higher tax rate at the state level plus the New York City income tax, folks, higher income people in New York City will be paying the highest personal income tax rates of anywhere in the country, actually higher than California, which traditionally has been even higher. So the concern obviously was, and we all hear this anecdotally, that folks are going to leave, they're going to change their legal address. So many people have second homes already. They learned during COVID that they could do their work remotely from Florida, even if they have business interests in New York. I think it would be fair to say at this point, because the personal income tax collections have actually been coming in stronger than projected, we haven't seen that show up in the numbers that people have been moving or changing their address. If that will be an impact, I think that's something we're just going to have to keep an eye on and see over time whether, in fact, that will happen. But for now, it seems that most people are be willing to stay here and pay those taxes. So again, the state's fiscal picture stronger than it's been in many, many months. Combination of federal aid, stronger economy, and increased tax revenue. From our perspective, the budget that was put together earlier this year did miss certain opportunities. Some of the gimmicks that we've often been critical of, pushing certain big payments into future years as a way to, kind of camouflage current spending. That continued. There was a $3.5 billion Medicaid payment that was pushed into a future year. More short-term borrowing was authorized. When you're flush with cash, you don't need to do more borrowing. So we hope, although it was authorized, in fact, it won't be utilized. And one of the big missed opportunities is that New York traditionally has underfunded our rainy day reserves, the money to be set aside for whenever a downturn happens. So, we were very pleased. As you know, we've had some changes in Albany of late. With the new administration, Governor Hochul's administration, they came out with their first quarterly budget update last month. And we were very, very pleased that, first of all, recognizing that the revenues have been coming in higher than projected, something that we had been expecting for a long time. They actually changed the financial plan moving forward, increasing the revenue projections by over $2 billion. That's probably a more conservative number than what the reality would be, but at least it's showing that we're catching up with the actual numbers and what's happening out there. And also, we were very pleased that they announced that the informal reserves are going to be increased by over $1 billion. And in future years, the rainy day reserves, we have also been urging more money be deposited to. Some $770 million is going to be added there. So we're already seeing some positive changes in terms of approaching the budget from the new administration. And with the revenue updates, particularly the out-year budget gaps that have plagued our financial position for a long time in New York really have been dramatically reduced, I mean, really to minimal levels, certainly for the next year or two. So all that's good news in terms of where the fiscal picture is at for the state. And that's important, obviously, for all of us and for all of our local governments. But there's still a lot of concern out there, potential for volatility. Some of it tied to public health, what will happen with COVID, what will happen with whatever the next variant may be. Obviously, you know, macroeconomic concerns about inflation, China, everything else that has a way of impacting us. So we still need to be cautious and we still need to be careful, and certainly we'll continue to track all these numbers. For local governments, though, the American Rescue Plan also has been a lifeline. For New York City, $5.9 billion, for local governments outside of the city, $4.9 billion. Certainly for our localities on Long Island, this has really been so helpful to ensuring that the budgets will be balanced and that we'll have the resources to deal with the impact of COVID and help with the recovery. You know, some of you have seen the breakdowns. We can give that to you if you're interested, but, you know, in terms of just, you know, the big numbers with Nassau County for the Coronavirus Relief Fund, $102.9 million, with the recent money from the American Rescue Plan, the local fiscal recovery fund, $385 million for Nassau County. For Suffolk, $257.7 million with the Coronavirus Relief Fund. For the local fiscal recovery fund that comes out of the ARP, $286.8 million. And the same is true for our towns and villages in our two cities. Really historic infusion of federal dollars that will be transformative for our community, certainly help us get us through a very, very challenging time. What I think is key, and we've pointed this out, particularly when we've looked at how New York City has handled some of the money, is that we have to recognize this money is not forever. And the money should not be used to spend on new programs where there's not dedicated local funding for down the road, because we will hit a fiscal cliff when this federal money is spent down. It's not going to be there forever. So making sure that at the local level, folks are using their brains wisely in terms of how the money is being spent and what the time frame is to utilize it is important. We are doing the best we can with all these billions coming into the state. So you may have seen, we just announced yesterday, we're doing a tracker, a dashboard that we're putting up online to chart the federal money that's coming in various programs, and on a monthly basis update how much money is going into what program and how quickly that money is being spent down, really to inform the public about where that money is going. So, you know, I think there's a concern out there, rightfully so. We're getting all these billions. How are we keeping track of it? How do we make sure it's being spent the right way? You know, it's a challenge for us from the controls office because not all the money goes through us. Some of it goes directly to other agencies and entities, but we're working with the governor's office, and certainly we'll be working with our local government friends as well to make sure we're all keeping track of this money responsibly. At some point, responsibly, it's because at some point we also have to account to the federal government with how we're spending this money. So it's a good problem to have, but we must always put that priority on transparency and accountability, especially when you're having, you know, this kind of largesse coming in from Washington. The other big issue, you know, that's out there, and obviously, you know, Rich and John alluded to it in terms of you know, the sewer issue out in Suffolk County, infrastructure. You know, the big debate in Washington now is what will happen with the infrastructure package, the bipartisan version, the House and Senate version, the negotiations that are going on. You know, for us on Long Island, as being part of an older state and a Long Island community that, you know, certainly in the past decades has grown exponentially in terms of development, population, the pressure on our infrastructure, be it roads, bridges, highways, sewer system, drinking water systems, drinking water, always such a big issue for us on Long Island. Our local governments cannot deal with this issue in terms of the need on their own. The state also can't deal with it all on our own, although the state has put more money aside through new programs and existing programs like the Environmental Protection Fund, but there's no doubt that we need additional help from the federal government. So my hope certainly is that they will break through the logjam. I mean, how many years, and probably when I last talked to you, we talked about infrastructure being the one area where there's bipartisan consensus that we need to do something. And yet a final resolution has been elusive. So let's certainly hope that we will see a breakthrough and that even more federal dollars will come devoted to infrastructure, very key to us on Long Island. And from an economic point of view, you cannot have a strong economy or growth in an economy if you don't have a modern transportation system. You can't attract businesses if they're not sure they're going to get a sewer hookup or if they're concerned about the quality of the drinking water. Another issue that we've tried to have folks focus on that is going to be a looming concern, as we talk about the need for businesses to recover, especially our smaller businesses, the unemployment trust fund. Obviously, so many people out of work early on with the pandemic, and a lot of people accessing unemployment benefits. We are owing the federal government right now about $9 billion in loans from the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund. It's a big amount of money. And ultimately, our businesses will have to carry the burden of that with increased rates. We are hoping that this may be another area that the federal government perhaps can forgive some of that loan. It has been signaled that we can use some of that ARP money to pay down some of that, although obviously many people have many ideas on how to spend the American Rescue Plan money, but some in our business community are asking that some of that, not only the American Rescue Plan money, but some of that unexpected increase in revenue coming to the state, that some of that be used to pay down some of this money that's owed to Washington unemployment insurance. What the resolution will be there, I don't know, but we put out our report because frankly, nobody had been talking about it as an issue. And certainly if businesses want to start rehiring, again, especially our smaller businesses, and they're suddenly now burdened with much higher than anticipated unemployment insurance rates, that's going to be a negative in terms of their rebuilding. Another issue that continues to be out there relates to broadband availability. Certainly through the pandemic, we learned that we relied more than ever on internet services. It's very, very tied to our economy, very tied to our educational programs as well. We also put out a report recently on the issue of the availability of broadband in terms of the infrastructure for it and the access to broadband in terms of the ability to afford a subscription. We found that 1 million New York households, 14% of the households in New York, do not have broadband access, meaning no subscription for services, including cell services. So that's a real concern. Long Island, only 9.2% of households on the island were without broadband access, meaning that they had no subscription for services. But that being said, 25% of Long Island households lack broadband availability in terms of the infrastructure. And that was actually the highest of all the regions in New York. So, sometimes folks talk about broadband as more of a rural community issue, but we've got concerns here on Long Island. And much of it does apply to the access question with income levels. 1 in 3 households in New York with incomes less than $20,000 do not have access to broadband services. So we're encouraged. Governor Hochul's administration announced they're coming up with a more detailed and refined broadband mapping survey that's going to help identify households and communities that are underserved. Part of what's being talked about in Washington are more initiatives to relieve the financial burden in terms of access on broadband. But I think that's an important one for us to stay tuned on, even from a Long Island perspective. Another report I'll mention briefly, the MTA's financial condition. As you know, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, very important to our regional economy, hit incredibly hard by COVID, continues to obviously have the Long Island Railroad ridership significantly down. I think they're at about 50% now. I think the last number I saw, New York City Transit, Metro North, and so on. It's still a precarious situation. Without the federal money that's come in, they would just not be able to provide the service. But how much more of that federal money will be coming in, we don't know. We were critical in our report of the transformation plan that had been announced a while ago, which talked about right sizing in terms of staffing, being more efficient, eliminating administrative jobs. And in fact, what we found is that most of the downsizing happened in operations and maintenance positions that really affect very directly the service. And in fact, most administrative positions were, kept intact. So we actually were pleased that the new leadership of the MTA acknowledged that the transformation plan really wasn't working, and they're basically abandoning it. And I think our report helped to push them to that conclusion. But the MTA is still facing significant budget gaps, and the concern there is that they're proposing to plug those gaps with a reliance on deficit financing, which only further burdens the overall MTA financial picture, limits their options in terms of their capital plan. So we'll continue to keep an eye on MTA's progress. And again, they are hopeful that the resolution of talks in Washington will help bring more money for public transit, not just obviously for New York, but across the country, and the MTA will benefit from that. Let me just end and get to your questions on a positive note. Rich mentioned one of my responsibilities is as trustee of the state pension fund. We are the third largest public pension fund in the country. We provide retirement security for 1.1 million New Yorkers, active employees, retirees, beneficiaries. All state employees are part of our pension system, and local government employees outside of New York City. And a significant chunk of our school district employees are part of our pension fund as well. For Long Island teachers, there's a separate teachers retirement fund, but we're the biggest public pension fund in the state. We got hit by COVID. We value our fund on March 31st of every year. COVID hit, the close down happened on March 15th. So markets tanked, and we had a slight negative in 2020, minus 2.68%. A lot less of a negative than when the Great Recession hit and we were down 26% in 1 year. But the good news, when we value the fund March 31st of 2021, we had an historic high in terms of return, over 33% return. I don't think we'll ever have a 33% return again, but it's great to be in that strong position. We know the markets, and certainly the past couple of weeks continue to be somewhat volatile, but we're still in a strong position. And what we have been able to do, a couple of things, I won't get into too much of the technicality, but the bottom line is that we are wisely, I think, positioning the pension fund for the future in a couple of ways. We made, what many viewed was a pretty bold decision to lower our assumed rate of return. We've currently been operating with an assumed long-term rate of return of 6.8%, meaning that over the next 20, 30 years, on average, we would hit 6.8% positive return. We've lowered that assumption out of 5.9%, more conservative expectation. Again, we're concerned about volatility and concerned about the low interest environment that seems to be continuing. I think that positions the fund well for the future. Also, because of this record run-up, we were able to do something called a market restart. The bottom line, we were able to reduce the contribution rate that our government employers are required to pay for the next go-around of rates. It's going to result in a savings of $1.5 billion statewide. It's going to relieve pressure on our local budgets. That's good news for our Long Island property taxpayers in terms of the impact on the local budgets. And doing all this, we're actually still well-funded. We're 99.3% funded, virtually a fully funded state pension plan. Very few state pension plans are anywhere near 100%, and we're just about at 100%. So we're very proud of that, and our plan is working well and sustainable for the future. We are doing more with various programs to invest in local economies across the state. Some of you heard me talk before about our in-state private equity investment program, where we make money available for startups or businesses that are expanding in New York that make a commitment to growing jobs in New York. And we continue to support and underwrite small business lending through Pursuit Lending, used to be called the New York Business Development Corporation. And we've got on Long Island about 128 small business loans there. Many folks don't realize that's pension fund money helping to support those programs. And we continue our partnership with the Community Preservation Corps to do more to promote affordable housing and rehab existing housing. So as always, with our pension fund, we understand our priority is retirement security for our members, but we also try to do as much good with that money as we can. Let me just sum up so we can get to your questions. That, from my perspective, I'm always asked, are we in good shape or in bad shape? Where is it headed? It's been a challenging 19 months. The federal money really has been the big game changer. I do see the economy slowly but surely in fits and starts continuing to recover. I am concerned about what's happening in New York City on many measures because we are very dependent on the strength of New York City. But I'm going to be an optimist that that's going to turn around as well. We're going to be putting out, I think next week or the week after, our update on Wall Street and how well it's doing, and it's going to be big numbers again. I mean, we're not as dependent on financial services as we once were. Our state's economy, our city economy is more diversified, but that continues to be a sector of the economy that, whether you love Wall Street or you hate it, the reality is when they do well, we get a lot of tax revenue. About 18% of the state's tax revenue comes from taxes related to financial services. So that's going to continue to, I think, be a bright spot for our state's economy. When I look at the different regions of the state, and I'm not saying it as a chauvinist, as a lifelong Long Islander, but certainly Long Island continues to be a bright spot. Not that we don't have our challenges, but the resilience of the Long Island economy and the Long Island community is very, very clear. And certainly to the extent that we have a highly developed healthcare system, highly developed educational system, both pre-K through 12 and higher ed as well. And you see the big investments that continue to be made, both by the federal government, by the state, in those two sectors. I think that positions us very, very well. Tourism coming back also is a plus for us on Long Island, and having a relatively educated workforce as well. All of that is a big plus. So, to the Long Island Regional Planning Council, your continued thoughts about what we need to do as a region to lift all boats, make sure that no one is being left behind, and that we do what's right, on a regional basis for our communities. We will, in the Controller's Office, certainly continue to look to you for good ideas and for leadership, partnership, and collaboration. So let me end it there and see what you might want to talk about.
Tom, maybe I'll just inject one little thought here. As we all know, the federal government, as you alluded to, and came through with some significant funds for the states as well as localities, et cetera. And that induced, I think, the state to increase funding to local school districts. How do you see that as a risk going forward if that money is still not there next year and in the following years?
I think it's less of a risk for the next 2 or 3 years. The problem is going to be, projecting further into the future. Look, I think there is a sustained commitment on the part of the state to fulfill the expectations for, what was part of the CFE decision. I think I just heard actually today the governor announced that there was a state lawsuit on this and they're going to settle it. So I think that, again, part of the thinking, whether you were for or against the tax increases, because some people said at the time that the legislature, the governor increased the tax rates, that why are you doing that? You're getting all this federal money, the economy's coming back, you don't need to do it. I think part of the calculation is that they wanted to make a bigger investment on the education piece. Those increased taxes are not permanent. Technically, they're supposed to expire, I think, in 2 or 3 years. I forgot the exact date. What I think will happen, John, is that if the assumption is the economy will come back strong enough that the revenues will take care of that. If it doesn't, as we've seen with other surcharges on the income tax, what will probably happen is that those surcharges on the wealthier New Yorkers will be extended, if not made permanent. So, I think it's a risk, but at this point, I think the commitment is there with whatever will happen with other programs to maintain a very strong investment in education. But certainly for the next year or two, I don't really see it as a risk right now at all.
Okay. Thank you. We have questions from the council. Alan, you want to shepherd that?
Happy to. So looks like we got a couple of our panelists with their hands raised. We'll start with Michael White. Michael, if you'd like to ask your question or share your comment, please.
Sure, thank you so much, Tom. It's always great hearing from you and seeing you. So just want to talk a little bit about if you could give us some ideas on, I think we have an opportunity in the Mother Nature Bond Act that should be coming up on the referendum, I guess, for this year, and how that might work in terms of making monies available. And actually, I'm sure what everybody wants to know is what kind of cost we might be facing over what period of time. Viewing it as a very positive step that we haven't seen in a while.
So the Mother Nature Environmental Bond Act, a couple of thoughts on it, Michael. So it's not on the ballot this year. It's going to be on the ballot next year.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
That's okay. But on the ballot this year is the constitutional amendment in terms of I may not be using the precise wording on the ballot, but basically talking about the right to a clean environment to be
Okay.
a constitutional right. And I'm in favor of that. And I think Newsday today endorsed it as well,
Yes,
for whatever that's
thank
worth. So a couple things on that, and some of it is still to be determined. Actually, from what I understand, they're gonna change the name. When you have change in governors, they often like to redo some of the things that were in place before. So I think they're dropping the Mother Nature part of it. I don't know why, but
Okay.
maybe because
Okay.
it sounded like that. What was that commercial for? Was it don't fool Mother Nature or fool yeah. But so I guess on the good news front, in terms of making money available, the governor announced, the current governor announced that the $3 billion proposal that Governor Cuomo proposed, she's going to increase it to $4 billion. So right out of the gate, it's going to be a bigger bond act than had first been envisioned. I think we need to wait and see as we head into the next session as to what the specifics are going to be, in terms of how that money is going to be allocated. But from my perspective, there's no more urgent need than investing in our environmental infrastructure, and it's very important to help our local governments with their needs. So I think it's going to be a very good proposal. We'll see how they whack out the different categories, but I'm sure it'll be positive in terms of what they're going to lay out there. And I think that generally speaking, in terms of the public, so it's a bond act, meaning voters have to pass on it. This tends to be the kind of issues that people support, and it tends to be the kind of debt that people are interested in saying yes to. So I think we have to stay tuned for some of the specifics, because it's obvious that the new administration is going to retool some of the specific categories. But the good news is that she's already upped it, by another $1 billion. So I think that's going to be welcome news for Long Island and for the rest of the state.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Excellent. Thank you for that. The next hand I see up is Teresa Sanders. Teresa, if you'd like to take yourself off mute, there you go, and ask your question or share your comment, please.
Thank
Hi,
you
Teresa.
so much. Hi, Tom. How you doing?
Okay.
I actually have two questions for you. So one pertains to your comment about how the Long Island hospitality community fared a little better. And just your opinion, was that part of the flight from New York City and people were trying to get out of New York, and do you think that that will trickle over into, the real estate market, people wanting to stay on Long Island, not just come out because they were in a panic? Now, my second question, I might as well ask right now, has to do with the broadband access. And this has been critical for us. I mean, it was almost to the point where if you couldn't get out of your house and you needed to access a doctor or find a vaccination facility, broadband is such a foundation now that I would love to hear your opinion in terms of how we should be advocating and moving towards getting more broadband access to people that are low income.
Yeah, on the first one, I think embedded in your question probably is the answer that, that people were looking for venues and opportunities outside of New York City, and Long Island was an easy place for folks to get to. In terms of the lasting impact, I think, it's probably too soon to tell. I think when COVID first started and a lot of folks that had second homes, kind of transplanted, out to the East End, and supposedly people buying homes and changing their address. I think some of that might have been over projected, because I do think with some of the trends I'm seeing now, people are starting to come back to the city. And so I just don't know whether that's going to be a lasting impact as far as the real estate market. There's no doubt that the real estate market has been very hot, and I particularly for the East End, where you have very wealthy folks and very not so wealthy folks. The legislation that Fred Thiel spearheaded, kind of building on the Community Preservation Fund initiative that Fred and I worked on 100 years ago when I was in the Assembly, that was dedicated to environmental funding and open space preservation. Now to create a pool of money through that same funding stream for affordable housing, I think that's a good development. And I know it applies just to certain East End towns, but that might even be a model for us to utilize for some of the other townships, because that affordable housing issue obviously is not limited to the East End of Long Island, although there's a unique dynamic there. But I think on that, Teresa, we probably just have to stay tuned a little more, to see what the actual long-term, trends will be. My gut is that it'll all kind of level off, and yeah, you may have a few more people that are going to transplant out to Long Island, but the city has always come back, and I think the city will come back again. And I think that with the new mayoral administration coming in, I think they're very focused on, because it's not just COVID, it's not just the economy, it's cleanliness, it's homeless people on the street and in the subways, it's crime, it's a whole bunch of things that have created some of these challenges. And there's obviously a lot of discussion about how to reverse some of that. In terms of broadband, a couple things. First of all, the state came up with an initiative to require lower cost subscriptions to make it easier for lower income households to afford the subscription. As you probably know, that ended up in court. So that initiative is on hold until the court cases are decided. The carriers, challenge that the state can't mandate something like that. There is a federal, I'm forgetting the exact title for, it's like an emergency broadband program to provide more money to help people afford the cost. There is an effort in Congress. Actually, when we released our broadband report, we did it with Congressman Antonio Delgado from the Hudson Valley, who's been a leader on this issue, to make that federal program permanent and really to expand it. So I think part of what we need to do is keep a close eye on what's happening as far as the federal delegation and how they are hoping to provide more dollars here to help people afford the subscriptions. The other piece really is for the state. I mean, the state has put some money aside, in the past to build out broadband. But we actually have an audit underway to look at how some of that money has been spent, because there's been a lot of criticism that the money, in fact, has not been spent well or wisely. I mentioned that Governor Hochul has announced that they're going to do a more specific mapping of where the need is, because there's, part of the issue, in addition to affordability, is how it's measured, whether a community has the infrastructure and access, and sometimes if you got, like, not to over dramatize, but you got one house in a census area that has access, it's kind of like the whole area, has the availability of internet. And that's just like a misstatement of the reality. So better mapping, which the governor indicated that they're committed to. Hopefully a positive resolution of the court case in favor of what the state is trying to do, and more help from Washington. All of that is needed. But I think the advocacy part's, important. And that's where, the Urban League and the council comes into play. The numbers that I mentioned, even though Long Island is viewed as, relatively speaking, an affluent area, we still have a lot of households that do not have subscriptions, and it's related to income. So adding this to the Long Island agenda, so it's not, because very often when it's debated, often it's more, I'm in the Adirondacks, I can't get this. But you look at New York City households, poorer households, you look at poor households on Long Island, the need is as dramatic in our communities as it is in some of the rural communities. How you solve it may be a little different, but the need is there. So that's the reason, Teresa, we did our report, because we felt people were not understanding enough how urgent this issue is, especially as you well are articulated, the lesson from COVID, how important this is for economic survival, for educational survival. So we're hoping our report will, be a rallying point for everyone. So when you all have nothing to do, go to our website and read our report. And we're hoping it advances the discussion.
Excellent. Thanks for that. The next hand up I see on our panelist side is Rich Cardino. Rich, if you'd like to ask your question or share your comment.
Yeah, Tom, thanks again for being with us this morning. The question I had was with regard to the federal government infrastructure bills. I know the soft infrastructure is still being negotiated. I was just wondering if we had any kind of idea of what was going on with the hard infrastructure bill and what that might mean to New York and Long Island.
I have a hard enough time keeping up with what we're doing in New York. I can't speak for the Washington, so I don't have specific numbers, and I think all of it's so
soft.
So well, it's also it's so much horse trading potentially going on. Look, I think that obviously for the Biden administration, this is key for it to get done. But particularly what should be the easy part, the roads and the bridges and the sewer system, the water systems. It unfortunately is tied up with not only the partisan divide and the bipartisan bill attempted to override that, but it's obviously very tied up with the internal divisions within the Democratic majorities in the respective houses. My political gut is that they can't walk away from this. It can't be a failure. But what it's all going to mean and how much it'll be in the physical infrastructure piece, aside from the social infrastructure piece, I just don't think anybody knows at this point. I wish I knew more, but my sense is, when I run into any of our federal colleagues, that nobody has an answer yet as to how it's all going to play out.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
All right, looking over our list once more, I don't see any other members with their hands raised. Although if you'd like to ask a question or share a comment, please go ahead and do that. So for now, I'll turn to the audience. Just a reminder for those who may have joined late. First off, this meeting is being recorded. And secondly, just a reminder, you can raise your hand by either using the raise hand button down below, or for the folks who are dialing in on telephone, you can press *9, and that does the same thing to me. And in either case, when the time is right, I'll call your name out or your digits to your telephone number, send a command for you to take yourself off of mute, and then you can ask your question, or share your comment that way. We also can use the Q&A box down below too, where you can type a question or comment in. I'll read it aloud, and a member of the panel or Tom will respond. So at the moment, I don't see any hands raised, so I'll go to the text-based Q&A. And the first question is from Jody. Hopefully I'm saying this right, Jody. Jody Giglio in Assembly District 2. And Jody asks, is the unemployment fund stable? And do you expect a rate increase for employers in the coming years to replenish the account?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier in the comments, this is one of the big issues we really have to figure out a solution to. So I don't know whether to call it stable or unstable, but we owe an awful lot of money to the federal government. That $9 billion price tag that we put out in our report is money that has to be accounted for at some point. So whether the federal government will waive any or all of it, I doubt they would waive it all, remains an open question. Whether some of the unexpected windfall in revenues that we have, whether there'll be a policy decision made by the state legislature and the governor to devote some of that money to pay down some of that debt is subject for debate right now. I know the Business Council of New York State is pressing for that, whether some of the federal ARP money can be used for that. Again, going to be at the discretion of the state. But the bottom line is, in the short run, yes, to the point of your question, our businesses will have to expect an increase in their unemployment insurance rates. And that's a concern if it would be a steep increase, if we have to pay back the full $9 billion. at a time that many businesses are struggling to stay afloat, to reopen, to expand, to be hiring again, it's really in effect like another kind of a tax, right? So yes, in the short run, our expectation is that there will be an increase in the rate. The question is how much and for how long. And so what I'd really recommend, take a look at our report. We really spell out, the issue that's there, available on our web. But this is really one that, from my perspective, has not been getting enough visibility and discussion because it could really be a drag on our economy and especially on our smaller businesses that are really have been struggling through the COVID environment.
Great. Thank you for that. Jody actually has a follow-up and hand raise. So what I'd like to do is read the follow-up, and then Jody, I'm going to send a command to you to unmute yourself. And if you want to either add a third part or clarify how I'm interpreting your question, you can do so. So first off, the part two to the question is same as just asked, but for Social Security. And then so with that, Jody, I'm going to send a command to you to unmute your mic. And with that, the floor is yours if you want to add on to that.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Honorable DiNapoli. Yeah, I think you're doing a great job, and I know that we are creating laws in Albany that is making your job more and more difficult every day and trying to figure out how to pay for all these things.
Yep.
So I do appreciate your energy in finding the funds to make sure that New York is protected and that the municipalities, the businesses, and all the people that do business in New York State can plan for success. So the unemployment question is one that is very concerning to me in that the state did put everybody on unemployment for extended period of times and then extended it again. And I'm glad that I'm hoping that it's finally going to end because our businesses need people to get back to work. So the concern of the increased taxes when they're coming out of this pandemic and along with other laws that have been created, such as the HEROES Act, which requires businesses to create an airborne infectious disease-free environment. And, I've heard from one employer that they had to put in blue lights in a 2,000 square foot area to kill any airborne infectious disease at a cost of $12,000. And, it was a real struggle for that business to pay that money at this time when they're just getting back to work. So I'm wondering if there's any plan or any money in the budget or anything where these businesses can tap into that funding source so that they are not pulling out of pocket when they're already, at a very low.
Well, first of all, thank you for your leadership and your advocacy, and appreciate that you're focused on the need for us to be supportive of the business community. There are some of those federal dollars, particularly ones that are targeted for small businesses that are part of the American Rescue Plan. So there is a process now to distribute some of that money. I think, though, in terms of the unemployment issue specifically, that's one that's still up for debate. So the state can take some of the surplus funds, if I could use that phrase, or let's say the unexpected revenue that has come in. It's in the discretion of the state as part of the the budget process between the legislature and the governor to devote some of that money to pay down some of that loan. But as you know, from an Albany perspective, everybody's got their own ideas on how to spend any new money that comes in. It's one reason why we've never been as well prepared for budget shocks is that rather than put money away for the rainy day, we always spend all the money that comes in and then some. So, that's the reason we put out our report to really say to, the legislature and the governor, hey, this unemployment issue and the money we owe on it is in some ways a ticking time bomb for many of our businesses, and we better figure out a solution. I do think ultimately that because it's such a big number, I wouldn't suggest the state on its own could absorb it, but that's again where hopefully, because Washington does have more resources than we do, they could at least waive some of it, extend the payments out in a way that gives us time for the economy to catch up, because the kind of rate shock that our small businesses may face on this, to your point, will really make it hard for them, in some cases to survive, but certainly to grow and expand, which is what we want them to do. So, at the end of the day, your colleagues in the legislature are going to have to figure out to what extent we want to use some of the state resources to try to address this.
Okay, and then that same question for the Social Security Fund.
Well, I mean, keep in mind, it's a federal program. So as I try to stay in my wheelhouse and not figure out, the federal programs. You saw, just this week, they had what, a 5.9% increase in the benefit because of inflation. So I'm sure our retirees and those Social Security are very happy to see that. But at the federal level, it raises the question again, at what point does that trust fund, run out of dollars? Now, look, realistically, no one's going to let the Social Security program run empty. That's just not going to happen. But especially if you're seeing, I think it was the highest benefit increase in, I think, 40 years, if I remember the number correctly.
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, if we're going to be entering this inflationary period and that's going to continue to be an escalating number, that's going to be a real challenge. And the inflation issue, which we really didn't touch on, is in some ways, lurking behind all of the economic assumptions. If inflation becomes not a temporary dynamic, which is what Powell and the Feds have been projecting it to be, but if in fact it's not a temporary blip, in fact it's going to be with us, I think it throws a lot of our economic assumptions out the door in a very negative way. So I think as far as Social Security, again, that's the federal responsibility. So I can't speak to what the solution will be to the higher payouts. And the other challenge, which is what we have with our pension fund as well, we're all living a whole lot longer. So the actuarial assumptions, for Social Security, just like it is for our pensions, we're just having payouts that we're having to project so much more into the future than we thought. People living well into their 90s is no longer unusual. That's a good thing. Let's thank the medical and healthcare community for that and smarter choices on lifestyle. But this also is going to increase the costs over time. And it's why we strive to keep our pension fund so well funded, because we understand that's what you have to do if it's going to be sustainable. Same thing with Social Security.
Okay. And then the next concern, I guess, that I had was the Climate and Community Investment Act with the 55-cent proposal for tax on gasoline for the incoming fossil fuels. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that act. We did have a panel on that this past Thursday, a week ago, and there are some significant concerns in there for New Yorkers when it comes to businesses having to pay these, costs for fossil fuels, and that most of the money is going to go towards renewable energy projects, which I'm all for, and we're all for renewable energy, but there's got to be a transition point. So I'm just curious as to what your perspective is on that, on the Climate and Community Investment Act.
After 20 years in the state legislature, I have the very enviable position of not having to comment on every piece of legislation that you all vote on. And certainly we didn't have a position on the legislation when it was going through the process, because frankly, that's up to the Assembly and the Senate and the governor, not up to the Comptroller's office. We have not done an analysis of the implementation of that law. So I can't comment in terms of what I perceive to be the impact of it. Maybe at some point we will do that. But I will say this, that New York took a very ambitious position on having the state transition in this area. I think to the point of your question, I agree with you, because one of the challenges we face in de-risking our portfolio with the pension fund, you can't overnight, as some people had suggested, again, I'll do it from perspective, something that we are in charge of. Some folks want us to sell all of our energy holdings related to traditional oil and gas, fossil fuels, and so on. And my argument was, first of all, just selling all that stuff doesn't necessarily change anything on the ground. Number one, because someone else will buy it up, that's all. But the real issue is investing in companies, and from the perspective of state policy, making decisions, particularly working with our utilities and with our business community, that recognize the fact that we can't stand still. That, to the point of your question, there is a transition that has to be underway. And those that don't understand that or won't support that, they're going to be left behind, and they should be left behind. So the real question becomes the timing on that transition. And that's where I think, for better or for worse, the legislature and the governor made the decision to be very aggressive in the goals. I think what we need to do at this point is measure how rapidly we're able to transition to those goals. I think to the point of your question, to see if there were any unintended consequences, with that lofty goal and ambition in terms of what it's really going to do, either to disrupting businesses or in fact, not make it possible to meet some of those goals. But, I think at the end of the day, for New York to take an ambitious bet in this area is smart, because the reality is that's where the world is going. And we have too many folks that still don't understand that climate change is real and that we're already behind in dealing with it. These 100-year storms are happening on a regular basis. I don't know about any of you, but I'm in a first floor apartment and I got flooded with Ida. And I never was flooded before. And it's not pleasant to go through re-sheetrocking and reflooring and things like that. So it's real, so I think being ambitious about it, I don't think is a bad thing.
Okay, that's all the questions that I have. Thank you very much for taking the time to answer them.
Thank you for your service.
And for
All
yours.
right. Thank you very much, Jody. Let me just take care of this. And all right, so I don't see at the moment any other hands raised for our panelists or our attendees. Just a reminder on how to do that. You can use the button down below to raise hand or *9 from the telephone. With that,
Alan,
I'm going to, yes.
Yeah, we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions from the chat.
Yep, okay. Well,
yeah.
that's where I was turning to next.
Okay.
Yep.
Just
First
1 or
one,
2.
yeah, sure. First one is from Ileana Carrillo, if I'm saying that correctly. Thank you for speaking at the session. You mentioned that the burden of unemployment funds owed by the state will fall on businesses who are trying to recover. What is being done to recover unemployment funds that were filed fraudulently, many using educational or public employees' information? Thank you.
That was a real problem in the beginning of all this. There was I guess a policy decision made, if I could say that, because of the devastation of the economy and so many people out of work and people without any income. The Department of Labor, which I want to make clear is not under the control of the Comptroller's Office, made the decision to pump out as much money as quickly as possible. And you're absolutely right. There were many instances of people stealing identity and putting in for unemployment claims. So a couple of things there. We from our office's perspective, because we heard of some of these complaints, we have been working with law enforcement when we uncovered some of these situations, because we do the payment end. We're the final part of the process. The Department of Labor does all the processing, and then we cut the final check. But when we became aware of some situations where there was a suspicion of fraud, we did referrals to law enforcement to follow up, and much of that is continuing. We also have, we did a short-term audit, and we have a longer-term audit underway to make sure the Department of Labor is tightening up their procedures and their process, because, frankly, there should have been some clear red flags that could have stopped some of this from happening when it did. So, there have been efforts there. I don't have a number for you, but a significant amount of money by Department of Labor has been recovered, from fraudulent activity. But I think the hard lesson from that experience is that we need to have our systems be much tighter than they were before we give this money out. So we could, it's easy to be critical of the mistakes that were made, and there were mistakes made, but I do understand that there were so many people that would just had no income, and they really were doing whatever they could to get as much money out the door as quickly as possible. So mistakes were made with good intent, but some of the same thing we saw, by the way, in the beginning of the pandemic. You remember everybody was really scrounging, for lack of a better word, for ventilators, for personal protective equipment. And part of what was happening, as I'm sure you all followed, our authority in the Comptroller's Office to review contracts, to secure this equipment was waived, right? Again, sometimes under the cloak of being more efficient and moving more quickly, you lower the threshold for appropriate oversight and checks and balance. And what happens is money goes out the door to places that it shouldn't go. That was an issue with some of those early contracts that sailed through, which we really didn't have the chance to scrutinize. And folks who had absolutely no experience or ability to deliver the equipment were getting, multi-million-dollar contracts. Again, much of that was clawed back. I think some of it is still under litigation at this point, but again, hindsight is one thing, and keep in mind, whether it's on, getting the unemployment money out or the money for the ventilators, try to remember the crisis mode that everybody was operating under. And that's not an excuse for what happened, but it is a partial explanation for some of the ability, as always happens when there's money out there. There are people with ill intent to line their own pockets, and if they could take advantage of any situation, even an emergency, they will do it.
Great. Thank you for that. Rich, I'm going to continue down to another question, if that's all right, if we have time. The next question I see is from Ed. Ed also has the hand raised. So Ed, I'm hoping that the question I read off is the same question you were going to ask verbally. And if that's the case, just lower your hand. If not, you can keep it up and we'll get to you if time permits. Ed asks, how are we able to address the issue of school boards having slush funds in the millions of dollars above the 4% legal limit and then using them to lower the school taxes?
That's got to be Ed Blumenfeld, even though you didn't say his last name. If it is Ed, hi Ed. Look, we've talked about this many times. I mean, it is a problem we've identified repeatedly in audits, not just on Long Island, but across the state. But certainly we've seen some big numbers on Long Island. I actually saw a recent, like this week, letter to the editor and the Anton papers criticizing our audit of this particular school district. And they were basically arguing that, well, we have all this extra money because we're preparing for tough times. Well, the problem is, particularly if you're still raising taxes when you don't need to, and all you're doing is storing money for no clear purpose, you're really hurting communities, I think, in the long run. And there's some argument as to whether or not that 4% figure on fund balance is a valid figure, but that's the figure that's set by the legislature. So when we audit and we see excess fund balance, we have to comment on it based on what the law says. The problem is, to the point of Ed's question, there is no beyond a controller audit, right? There's no penalty for a school district exceeding that limit, which is why many of them continue to do it. The other problem we see is that there's in many districts an inappropriate use of reserve funds. Reserve funds are not set up as they should be. They're not dedicated to the specific purpose. Reserve funds are not a bad thing. As I said, we're critical. The state doesn't do a good job with it. But many of our local governments also don't manage it in the right way. So, I think that, this is an area where, because, keep in mind, when we do our audits, we're not given an enforcement power, right? So we do it. Rich, you remember this, if we ever audited Hempstead, which you were the supervisor, right? We could say something and be critical. I'm not saying we were when you were supervisor, I'm sure we weren't, or whoever was the controller then. But, our recommendations, they rise or fall on the value of the recommendations. A local government or a school district is not required to follow our recommendations. So this is the problem we have, with the issue of excess fund balance. In some cases, when we point this out, the community will go to the school board meetings, go to the budget hearings, and they'll say, why are you increasing our taxes while you have all this money that's basically stranded and sitting there? And sometimes it forces school boards to change. But, unless there's going to be a change in terms of legislative requirements in this area, or at a local level, the taxpayer is saying, hey, we're following what you're doing, and you have all this money that's just sitting there and you're not using it, instead you're taxing us. Unless there's either a community uprising on it or the legislature puts more teeth into the requirements, I don't see a change other than us continuing to do our audits and pointing out that this is a problem.
Okay, Thank you for that.
Alan, we have time for one more question. I see Michael Borsak's in the Q&A. Why don't we hear from him, and then we'll want to thank Tom for taking up most of his day today.
Okay, so Michael has two questions. I'll read the first one that came in. Michael asks, what is the status of the SALT cap repeal or increasing the $10,000 amount? Tom Suozzi has been championing this issue.
Well, I saw Tom Suozzi this week at Columbus stuff, and he tells me they're working very hard on it. You know, it's federal. So Michael, I just try to keep track of what's going on in Albany. I can't tell you, you know, with the horse trading going on in Washington, I have no idea if that's going to survive. I certainly hope that it changes, you know, at least increasing the cap. But, you know, obviously there are many people that, you know, in states other than New York, Massachusetts, Jersey, California, that have a different opinion on this. So you know, other than the fact that from what I've heard, not just Tom Suozzi, but, you know, our congressional delegation is working hard. Chuck Schumer has identified this as a key issue. But with all the horse trading that's going on, I wish I could tell you I knew what was happening in Washington on that. I just don't know.
Okay.
That being
Thanks,
said,
Matt.
Alan, I think we're done with the questions.
Great.
Okay.
Yep.
I'd like to thank our State Controller, Tom DiNapoli, again, longtime friend, who's been a friend, and his service is greatly appreciated, not only on Long Island, but in the state of New York. You're doing a great job, Tom, and you've always been accessible for your people, and whatever we could do, the Planning Council looks forward to continue working with you. So thanks for all you do. God bless you. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Rich. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Stay well. Stay well.
Thank you. Next order of business, Rich, you want to continue? We have with minutes and then some resolutions.
Yes, we have Supervisor Clavin has joined the meeting, so we do have a quorum. And the first item of business would be the adoption of minutes from the July 14th, 2021 meeting.
Do I have a motion to accept? Jeff Kraut.
Motion.
Okay,
Second.
seconded. Seconded,
Second.
Liz. Any discussion? Not all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? So moved. Rich?
All right, the next order of business is Resolution 2021-111, which authorizes an agreement with the New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission, known as NUIPIC, to transfer $100,000 of the Long Island Nitrogen Action Plan grant to NUIPIC to retain a bioextraction environmental analyst to advance the nutrient bioextraction initiative. LINAP has identified bioextraction as an important strategy in reducing nitrogen loads. The DEC, the council, and NUIPIC partnered to start the nutrient bioextraction initiative. Obviously, the goal of the initiative is to improve water quality in New York marine waters. Much has been accomplished already. We've had pilot projects supporting the development of the industry, creation of a GIS system, a shellfish aquaculture guidance document, and we're also going to have a bioextraction economic viability study and development, looking at the species and the markets that have the most potential. Currently, Kristen Krzeski is the bioextraction coordinator. She operates out of the DEC Region Office #1 in Stony Brook. Once we bring on board the bioextraction environmental analyst, she will work with, or he will work with, Ms. Krasinski at the Region 1 office.
Okay, do I have a motion to accept?
Make the motion.
Okay, Michael, seconded by Jeff. Any other discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? So moved. Rich?
All right, the next resolution is 2021-112, which authorizes an agreement with Epic 5 Marketing for consulting services, including public relations, social media, education, and marketing strategies for the council, but also for the Long Island Nitrogen Action Plan. We entered into an agreement with Epic 5, which is a New York State certified woman-owned business enterprise in 2018. The agreement's been renewed annually since then, as the services rendered have been performed in a professional manner and have been satisfactorily completed. This resolution will authorize an agreement through 2022 for an annual sum of $42,000.
Do I have a motion to adopt?
Motion.
So
Jeff, and Jeff. Jeff Crown, Jeff Geo. Any discussion?
I just had a
Comment?
question, John.
Yes,
The,
Michael.
so the breakdown between what the council actually pays out of our budget versus what LINAP pays.
Rich?
Yes, it's split. The grant pays for half of it and we pay for half of it out of the operating funds. Credit to Epic 5, we actually paused their retainer when the grant was paused for New York State. So they actually have their retainer for 15 months. And now this would bring it back to the original amount of the retainer where we would tap into the LINAP grant since it's been reinstated. So
Yeah.
this brings us back to the original amount of the retainer.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Epic 5 because while they have the retainer, they did not have the work effort. And they've stood by us during some difficult financial times. So I'd like to comment on that. Michael, any
Thank
other
you.
comments?
No, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? So moved. Rich, any other council business on that?
No, that's all the formal business for the meeting, John.
Okay, I'll just make a few brief comments and turn over to you for a council report. Just being briefly, first of all, again, thanks again to Controller Napoli. He's always been a friend of Long Island, but he comes very prepared with a lot of good information for the audience and for the council members themselves. I think we all know we live in very interesting and challenging times. You have to pick up the newspaper every day, get something new, whether it's happening in Washington or in Albany. But I think, coming out of the pandemic, we're not out of it yet. We all know that. We've also got some major economic challenges. And now all of a sudden we have supply chain problems, which are contributing towards the inflation. Energy prices are skyrocketing. All these things really affect Long Island. I mean, worker shortages, et cetera. So we're going to have to see where we go. But we have some challenging times and we need to continue working together to make sure that we're addressing them. I mean, Long Island, and the controller alluded to it, not just Long Island and county governments and town governments, but also the city and the state. They were really supplied with some significant funding out of Washington. And as a result, it's helped the budget from an operating perspective. But I can tell you that from a capital perspective, everybody is waiting on to see what happens on the classic infrastructure bill. And we don't know about the reconciliation or the social infrastructure bill. On the classic infrastructure bill, you have towns and counties and the city and the state waiting to see if there's going to be some significant funding coming from the federal government. If so, government would rather have somebody else pay for it than themselves, and we understand that. So hopefully Congress gets its act together and they decide what's appropriate and without excessively burdening our children, our children's children. But on the other hand, we do need our infrastructure upgraded. As the controller alluded to earlier, one thing that governments always agreed on was we need to fix infrastructure. It was the one issue that both sides always agreed on, is that we need to upgrade and fix our infrastructure. The problem was Republicans say, yes, cut spending, and the Democrats say raise revenue. So we've never gotten there, whether it's been through the Obama administration or through the Trump administration, and now we're battling it again here in the Biden administration. So let's hope that Washington gets its act together, because Lord knows we're still in the funk here of a pandemic, and we need to come out of it. So that being said, Rich, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, John. Thank you. Let me just give you a brief update on our STEAM challenge, recognizing the need for greater interaction between professionals engaged in science, technology, engineering, art, and mathematics pursuits in our schools. The council developed a STEAM challenge related to the Nitrogen Action Plan for all Long Island middle school and high school students. It's now in its third year. The goal of this initiative is to connect students, their teachers, and communities with issues addressed in LINAP. The challenge invites teams of students to develop and design projects for their school grounds, which will either reduce the use of fertilizers and pesticides and water consumption, or devise methods to collect and treat stormwater runoff on the school property. For the 2021 STEAM Challenge, the top winners came from Calhoun, Comac, New Hyde Park, Memorial, and Sewanaka. $2,500 grants will be awarded to each of the top teams to implement their proposals. The teams are in the process of developing their designs, budget, maintenance plan for the project, and plans for how the project will be incorporated into lesson plans and engagement with a larger community. Once the plans are approved, grants will be awarded, and we'll have award ceremonies similar to what we had last year. The good news is we've started year 3 of the STEAM Challenge. It was launched on October 12th, inviting students and their schools to participate, and we will have letters of interest by January 10th, 2020. I want to mention a few agreements which the council has executed since we last met in July. An agreement with Suffolk County for the nitrogen loading mile to be created by CDM Smith was completed. The agreement with Nassau County for a consultant to manage Nassau County septic system replace grant program was also completed. And an agreement with Hofstra University in the town of Hempstead for water quality monitoring in the South Shore Estuary was completed, and the council has received funding to continue the monitoring through 2023, and work has begun on the 2023 budget. And finally, we offered support, as John mentioned earlier. We're delighted that Tom stepped up and expedited the paperwork on the Forge River, the Forge River project in Mastic and Shirley. Also passed was the Carls River project in Babylon Town. These are important initiatives in LINAP, and the council has been behind them 100%. We're delighted to see the legislature, the Suffolk County Ledge acted, and soon there'll be shovels in the ground connecting over 4,000 properties to sewer service. Very significant for Suffolk County. That completes my report, John.
Thank you, Rich. New business, any new business from council members? Any hands go up? No? That being said, public comment, if you will, either through the chat room or raising hand. Alan, you want to administer that? See if there's any public comment?
Sure thing. Once again, to raise hand, use the button down below, *9 if you're on the telephone, or use the Q&A. We do have one item in Q&A, but that's from Michael Borsick. I believe it was for the prior conversation. So Michael, I don't know if we're going to be able to answer that question. There are no net new questions in the Q&A. We'll kind of give that a couple seconds to see if anyone adds anything.
Yeah, that question is from the prior speaker, right?
So I'll ignore that for the moment. I'm sorry, not ignore, I'll bypass that for the moment just to let you know, because we don't have anyone able to answer it. So looking once more, I don't see any new hands raised. I don't see any new items in the Q&A.
Okay, that being said, do I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion.
Michael, seconded by Jeff Kraut. Jeff's got the raise hand function right on his screen. So, any other comments? Okay, all in favor?
Adjourn.
Aye. So move, so adjourn. Stay well, everybody. We'll talk.
Thank you.
Next month.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.